Oh, hey there. And welcome back to what I've chosen to call A History of Rock and Roll in Film. And rock and roll. You may call it what you like. Today I'm leaving off a bit of time with the White Zombie saga, and I still haven't finished the Van Halen saga. I jumped off the Van Halen saga before the last episode was done, just to get the first White Zombie episode ready for Halloween. And then I did another one, and then I had all the stuff recorded to end that whole piece, but then I reached out to Ivan DePrume, the longest-running drummer of White Zombie, to see if he would want to do an interview, and he expressed expressed a willingness, that's the word, but I haven't heard back from him since, and I've sent him a message, so he may be too busy for that, so maybe I will stop waiting and finish the White Zombie saga and hopefully have a chance to talk to him after that, and I'll just do a little add-on. Maybe, we'll see. And then I'll finish up the Van Halen as well, but I guess at the end of the year, I just needed a diversion from all the stuff I was thinking about and all the things that I had planned to finish by now, and just to jump into something totally unlike those last two endeavors. I think I was feeling a bit too one note for doing two metal bands in a row, essentially hard rock, heavy metal. And I found a bunch of books on Pink Floyd and the Grateful Dead, and wanted to finish up this episode that I started working on months ago after watching Zabriskie Point, thanks to a recommendation from a listener named Tim. Thank you, Tim. I learned a lot so far, and there's more to go after this episode. I'm not sure how much farther I'll go, but so far, all the reading's been very rewarding. You'll get more of my take on Floyd, Dead, and my involvement, with them. My awareness of both later on. But the short, easy version is I've been into Pink Floyd for a long time, not as deep as some friends of mine. I'm very easily categorized as a obscured by clouds through the wall kind of Pink Floyd fan. Everything before that and after that is just fine, but doesn't move me in the same way. Grateful Dead, I had no preconceived notions about, no prior scholarship of.
And a hearty welcome to our drive-in theater. We have a wonderful evening's entertainment lined up for you, one that will provide several hours of pleasurable relaxation and diversion for you and your family.
Hey, let's talk about Pink Floyd and Zabriskie Point. They had set aside studio time as late fall 1969 in EMI Studios in London. And in Italy, first time they had ever done any recording in Italy, apparently, for just over a month. So this is we're going to just set aside time to create music for this film soundtrack that we've been commissioned for. The soundtrack sessions would actually come out with a big, important bit of Pink Floyd history that wasn't fully formed at the time. I have 5 different books to pull from, and I don't want to say too much about which thing is going to happen with this sort of introduction to the situation here. But when they... let me say this. Richard Wright. I'll just say that. It's a piece that owes its existence mostly to a fella named Richard Wright in Pink Floyd. Now, Pink Floyd had been creating soundtrack music for filmmakers before this, at least a couple of times. And that was experiences like The Committee and More. I think More is the one that yields Obscured by Clouds, if I'm not mistaken, which has a tune on it that I love called Free For. The situation with Michelangelo Antonioni was a lot more hands-on, would be a nice way of saying it. Fussy britches is my way of saying it, having not been there, but he was not the same kind of filmmaker as Peter Sykes or Barbet Schroeder. Barbet. Nick Mason says, the problem was that Michelangelo wanted total control, and since he couldn't make the music himself, he exercised control by selection. So there's a big frustrating back and forth going on between Pink Floyd and the director, and Floyd ends up recording multiple versions of a whole bunch of tracks just so they can cover all their bases and hopefully deliver whatever the fuck it is that Antonioni wanted. They did multi-channel mixes of several songs, allowing him, the filmmaker, to manipulate all the channel faders in the studio control room, adding or subtracting instrumental parts that changed each song's character to his liking. These bits I'm reading right now are from Bill Kopp's Reinventing Pink Floyd, From Syd Barrett to the Dark Side of the Moon. Even after going to such lengths, the director was not satisfied. In his biography of Pink Floyd, Nicholas Schaffner amusingly cites Roger Waters' recollection of presenting tracks for the director's approval. And this shows up in multiple books, these quotes. "It's very beautiful," he quoted Antonioni as saying, "but it's too sad," or "it's too strong." Waters summed up the experience as sheer hell. What would it feel like to be Roger Waters, a soon to emerge as a complete control freak maniac master who was rewarded for his control so extensively over a few albums, and then reduced to, this is my opinion, I'm not ruling on this, I'm just saying from an outsider's perspective who didn't grow up with Pink Floyd and didn't grow up with an intimate knowledge of the ins and outs of that band, just looking at, what I've seen and what's been related to me and what I've learned. As an American, I was born in 1977, and, in 1991, I was like, oh my God, Pink Floyd's The Wall's 10 years old. That's so old. And there, as far as I was concerned as a young person, there was nothing between The Wall and Division Bell when it came to Pink Floyd. That's my bias. I'm not saying that because I'm right, as I say routinely in this show over the last 3 years. I'm saying that so you can judge me appropriately and judge my opinions appropriately. But the idea that Roger got exactly what he wanted after all those years, and then, after, 8-9 years of controlling his own shit, he didn't come out on top necessarily. He came back strong. I will say that. And I don't want to be too, I don't want to misdirect you in my opinion about Roger Waters. I am just saying, I think there's something to be said for the fact that he exerted full control with Bob Ezrin over Pink Floyd's The Wall than the next Pink Floyd album that he, had credits on was The Works, which didn't do well. And then his own solo career did well as far as artistically and what he wanted to communicate. But it wasn't until he came back to Berlin with The Wall in 1990 and then did multiple arena and amphitheater tours rehashing old Pink Floyd stuff that he became a major success at this late date in his career. I don't think financially, and ticket sales wise and attention wise, right? Like, he's not filling amphitheaters full of people screaming for radio chaos, is he? Or amused to death, is he? Amused to death, a phrase that's brilliant, but someone else wrote for him. Just saying. While Pink Floyd was being very boring, I'm just if you think I'm biased about one guy over another guy in Pink Floyd, they were very boring in the 80s. They were very boring in the early 90s. That's okay. It's okay. It's okay. You can admit it. You can admit it. You can admit it. It's fine. Anyways, I love the idea that he gets so burned, like being fucked with by more powerful people than him financially. And I'm drawing a line between that and him finally exerting the control he wanted when it comes to animals, the wall, the works. Anyhow, in the end, only 3 Pink Floyd songs would be used in the film. This is back to the book. Instead, Antonioni selected an odd, seemingly random assortment of already existing tracks by artists including Patti Page, the 1950 hit single Tennessee Waltz, I Wish I Was a Single Girl Again by high lonesome folk singer Roscoe Holcomb. Adding insult to injury, though Pink Floyd did get its travel expenses covered when Zabriskie Point, the soundtrack LP, appeared on MGM Records, the band was third billed behind the Grateful Dead and Kaleidoscope. Notoriously unhip MGM Records president Mike Herb ended his LP liner note essay with a prescriptive message. The film and the music are not really meant to be understood, but to be lived. The 3 tracks that did appear on Zabriskie Point film and soundtrack LP were Heartbeat, Pig Meat, based on a very sort of hypnotic cymbal-less drum beat from Nick Mason. That's from the text of the book. Atop that repetitive, almost looped-sounding percussion, Richard Wright adds simple yet melodic single-note runs on his Farfisa organ. Neither Roger Waters' bass nor David Gilmour's guitar is audible in the track. Then there's little bits of sound effects, dialogue mixed in there, little snippets of orchestra music from the film. This appears on screen mixed in mono, and it runs slightly longer than its LP counterpart. Some of the found sounds are different between the two versions as well. There's a track called Crumbling Land. They would create multiple versions of this and different mixes of it. It has what is described as a West Coast folk rock vibe. With instrumental hits, according to the author of this book, Bill Kopp of the Grateful Dead, and lots of vocal harmonies, high ones, courtesy of David Gilmour, that, according to this author, strongly recall Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Maybe that was intentional. Maybe that was just something David Gilmour wanted to do while he was there in the studio. Who knows? But the author says it would not have been out of place on the soundtrack for Barbet Schroeder's More. The recording included on the soundtrack LP brings Roger Waters' bouncy, insistent bass line forward in the mix, with Nick Mason tapping along mostly on hi-hat. That version's midsection has a dreamy interlude more in keeping with the customary Pink Floyd sound. A gong signals a return to the main melody. Multiple versions of Crumbling Land exist, both released, including one on the Early Years collection, and unreleased on bootlegs. Some run as long as 6 minutes. Perhaps the most interesting outtake is an unreleased version featuring a rock electric full band introduction. But it's essentially a different song, albeit one very much in the style of Buffalo Springfield, which Gilmour playing in a more twangy manner than his usual style. A thunderous tom-tom run from Nick Mason accompanies it. After about a minute, the rock arrangement segs into the familiar folky section. So the third track that's used for the big explosive scene at the end of the film is entitled Come In, number 51, Your Time Is Up. And it wasn't entirely new. It is another sort of mutation of careful with that axe, Eugene. Waters will leave out the title phrase, as he did when the tune was called Beset by Creatures of the Deep, and part of The Man and the Journey, The band plays a different key than on the original. Roger Waters' whispering is more prominent, and David Gilmour's higher vocals is more prominent as well. There's a blood-curdling scream from Roger Waters, and the accompanying musical cacophony is used in the film, as the author says, to coincide with the highly stylized slow-motion depiction of an explosion, and even against the backdrop of so little of the band's music being used in the finished movie, represents one of the most effective uses of Pink Floyd's music on the silver screen.
Show starts in 8 minutes.
So since we're talking some Zabriskie Point today, I am going to warn you now. This is a movie that is old enough that I am not protecting you from spoilers. I am going to go back into some of the sources online that I've previously used for movies like The Deadpool, and at least one other more recently. I'm going to check IMDb. I'm going to check Roger Ebert. I'm going to check TV Tropes. And this time I'm also going to check The New Yorker. It looks like it's just a very short profile on the film by Richard Brody. It says, plunging into the maelstrom of American politics, the Italian director Michelangelo Antonioni emerged with a daring and flamboyant blend of fiction and documentary in Zabriskie Point from 1970, which screens on June 2nd at Metrograph in a series programmed by the photographer and filmmaker Cindy Sherman. It is no longer the middle of 1970. So if you're listening to this, please do not report to anywhere named Metrograph in the hopes of watching this film. If Metrograph indeed still exists. A student activist named Mark, played by Mark Frechette, who is implicated in the shooting of a police officer at a campus strike in Los Angeles, where police killed a protester, steals a small plane, and escapes to the Mojave Desert. There, in a duet for airplane and automobile that resembles a balletic pas de deux, he encounters a young... You can tell I've never said that phrase in my entire life just now. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your indulgence. He encounters a young secretary named Daria, played by Daria Halprin, who is driving to a corporate conference. What ensues amid the encroaching development that they find there, development being like land developers building crap, is an orgy of destruction, along with an actual orgy that eroticizes the craggy and forbidding landscape. For all the righteous outrage, government violence, and industrial corruption that Antonioni depicts, he also exults in the ornamental extravagance of mass culture. By way of widescreen images filled with the giddy illusions and gaudy forms of American advertising, architecture, and technology, he realizes his freest, wildest aesthetic adventure. I guess. I think there's a lot more going on in this movie than that could have been discussed or expanded upon. But there's a lot about this movie that's not definite. There's a lot about this movie that's open to interpretation. So whatever. I guess if you got a word count, if you got a word limit and it's the early 70s and you want to keep your job at the New Yorker, don't get overly indulgent with it, I suppose. Or maybe there was more that got edited out. Interesting. Ain't it? Now, Grateful Dead. I want to read from Rock Lives by Timothy White from Rolling Stone, specifically a 1989 piece. And for folks that aren't too familiar with the Dead, I think after I skip past the intro and the discussion of what the facility they're in, their last album was Built to Last. They're in a warehouse rehearsal recording studio in San Rafael, California, and, describing Jerry showing up and Bob Weir coming with him and going into this big facility and turning on the lights and turning on the amps and starting to run through songs. And as one by one, other members of the band sort of show up and pop in to rehearse Death Don't Have Mercy in This Land, which was noted as a Reverend Gary Davis tune. Love me some Reverend Gary Davis. Thanks to guy named Scott H. Byram, who I think came from Texas and played at Hattie's Hat in Ballard, North Seattle, years ago. A lot of foot stomping, kicking, field holler kind of music. Blah, blah, blah. Casual run through of the song, etc., etc., etc. It says, June 7, 1990 marked the 25th anniversary of the Grateful Dead, and in that quarter century, the band, its organization, and its crazy loyal fans have comprised an extended family unique in the heritage of American rock and roll. Musically, the ancestry of the Dead encompasses a host of preliminary combos. Bob Weir, born Robert Hall on October 16, 1947, was with a high school band called the Uncalled Four, F-O-U-R. The night he met Jerry Garcia, who began as Jerome John Garcia, August 1st, 1942, while backstage at the Tangent, Palo Alto, California. Jerry was playing banjo with the Black Mountain Boys at the time. But in 1964, Jerry and Rob joined with blues harmonica player named Ron Pigpen McKernan to form Mother McCree's Uptown Jug Champions. A year onward, Bill Kreutzmann and Phil Lesh helped usher the Jug Champions into electric blues rock notoriety in the Bay Area as the Warlocks. Believing there was another Warlocks currently recording, they decided in mid-65 to change their name. In a hefty dictionary, Garcia found the phrase Grateful Dead, itself derived from both an Egyptian prayer and a folk song identified by British ethnomusicologist Francis Childs. The band saw the phrase as emblematic of cyclical change rather than macabre surrender, and they embraced it. Late in 1967, the members took up residence at 710 Ashbury Street and became regulars at Bill Graham's Fillmore Auditorium and the Family Dog's Avalon Ballroom, wherein they weren't spearheading a steady series of free shows in Golden Gate Park. The Bay Area during 66 to 67 was the hub of a radical cultural transformation, and the Dead were the key figures in its colorful convolutions as they experimented with LSD, played the Trips Festival, and partied with Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. Percussion virtuoso Mickey Hart joined the Dead in 1967 and accompanied the band in its relocation to Marin County early in 1968 to concentrate on recording their singular meld of folk, country, rock, blues, Afro-Asian forms, and experimental composition a la Stockhausen. They get signed to Warner Brothers. They put out some records. Blah, 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 blah. By 1971, the quintessential live band proposed another live LP it planned to title Skullfuck. As Joe Smith recalls, the artwork the band submitted to Warner Brothers for the 2-record live set was a skull with Skullfuck on a scroll across it. I looked at it and muttered, "Is this another prank?" See, they hated Warner's, and they weren't the only ones. See also Frank Zappa. See also Black Sabbath. And I was the only one they would talk to, and they hated me, but they hated me less. So I called a meeting. I prepared by phoning district attorneys around the country, plus major stores and record departments like Sears and J.C. Penney, asking all of them, what would you do if you were confronted with an album called Skullfuck? Their response was grim, but the band was adamant. So the Dead and its support crew came down from San Francisco for a formal confrontation with the Warner's brass at the L.A. Continental Hyatt. Why are you all here? Smith asked when confronted with the crowd of concerned parties. Because it's a family decision, they roared back. After hours of debate, Smith said, look, you're deep in debt. If we call it Skullfuck, it will get into a handful of head shops, which you can't collect money from anyhow. And you'll sell 8,000 copies tops. Moreover, no radio station will touch an album with this title. In other words, out there, it will never exist. And you'll owe us 100,000 plus. The band huddled and then said they'd tired of the wrangle. As far as they were concerned, Warner's could call the album anything it liked, including Grateful Dead, which it became, selling 1.5 million units. After that, they put out Working Man's Dead, American Beauty, and more emphasis with those on Garcia's melody writing, Bob Weir's harmonies, Robert Hunter's lyrics, and some pedal steel guitar as well. Now, if you think I'm just being a lazy bum here and I'm just reading straight out of this Rolling Stone book like some basic bitch, no. This is going to be my jumping off point to Phil Lesh's book for a second here. This is this era that I'm kind of pausing for to basically read straight from his words, because for someone like me that was not a deadhead, I think this is another one of those, like, okay, this is a kind of a cool encapsulation of what was going on and what made things work right at this time. And with the Dead in general, I think. After finishing up mixes on American Beauty, we were eager to hit the road for our next tour, which started about a week later, playing colleges and theaters all over the East. It was about this time that the Dead began to emerge as the engine of choice for aesthetic exploration among college students hungry for the unknown. In my view, it's always been one of the functions of art to provide experiences that evoke danger and uncertainty, and to resolve those uncertainties into a higher perspective that embraces the paradox of chaos and order. To a young person at that time, a Grateful Dead show could offer this kind of adventure in a protected environment, gathered together with like-minded people in a community of kindred spirits. We played long shows, so those who were tripping could peek and return. The music wove a web between pulls of Dragon's Breath, Wrathful Deity space jamming, and simple tunes telling stories full of weird characters and situations out of American legend. And it generally resolved in the end to raucous, shake your bones, and dance rock and roll fireworks. It's not surprising that the band became more popular outside the big urban areas, Boston, Philly, New York. We were offering something rarely available in the button-down culture of the time, or any time since for that matter. A chance to take a chance, to go on an adventure of sorts with a large group of one's peers, and to return to reflect and tell the tale the next morning. It didn't hurt that tapes of our shows were now being traded widely around the college circuit, in what remains the best decision we never made. Allowing tapers to record and trade our shows essentially usurped the function of studio records and with live performances. Since no two shows were alike, every show that went forth and multiplied itself on the trading tree was another advertisement for our live shows. Every friend or sibling of a deadhead that weaseled a copy of a favorite tape and passed it on was contributing to the growth of the community and to the size of our audience. We closed out the year with more gigs at home and began the new year of 1971 with more gigs in January, up and down the West Coast. And in February, it was back to the East Coast for a series of gigs at the Capitol Theater in Port Chester, New York. These shows were interesting because they incorporated an ESP, extrasensory perception experiment, conducted by Mickey's acquaintance, Dr. Stanley Krippner. The audience was asked to send images projected on screen in the theater to a dreaming research subject at the Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. The experiment was statistically successful enough to be written up and published in a formal peer-reviewed journal of psychology. But that was just a small part of the significance of these shows. Even though he had done our best to buoy him up, Mickey had been sinking into a terrible depression. Mickey Hart. Ever since Lenny had ripped us off and split with the money. There's a lot of that in the Dead history as I've been combing through some of these books and reading articles. There's a lot of moving and shaking going on. There's a lot of backstabbing. There's a lot of parasites coming in, as you will get with any group of idealists coming together, living on a compound, or a commune, whatever you want to call it, and being really interested in changing the perception of people in the culture and doing the right thing and constantly trying to maintain some sort of balance between the chaos and the order with all these different strong personalities, very much like Pink Floyd as far as the personalities go, I think, because there's a couple of strong ones and there's a couple more submissive ones that still contribute, but aren't, like if it was up to them, nobody would fight. No one person would be driving this ship, but leaders got to lead. They got to, things aren't getting done. They step in and they have a vision for where things should go. Apparently Mickey Hart is not one for enforcing his will on everybody. He's slipped away. These are my guesses, barely knowing anything about the band, but he's clearly getting reclusive and going inward during this time. By the time we got to the Capitol, he was in an acute state of paranoia, sleep deprivation, and suicidal agony. Stanley Krippner hypnotized him to help get him through the first show. But afterward, he was still so desolate that Stanley drove him out to his mother's on Long Island, where he finally was able to get some sleep for 3 days. When he woke up, he decided to leave the road, never a favorite part of it for him, and work out his destiny at home on his ranch, with the explicit understanding that he was more than welcome anytime he wanted to rejoin us, wherever we were. Now, what about the other band members? He says, this development left us effectively a quintet again, with only one drummer. But what a drummer. Billy's playing had evolved so much during the 8-limbed drum octopus period that he was easily able to drop right back into his original role as the powerhouse of the band. Spiritually, Mickey's departure left a big hole in the band's aura. His boundless enthusiasm and demonic energy were a large part of our emotional gestalt. And for the first few months after that, we didn't play as well as we could have. We were, in essence, tiptoeing around the hole that he'd left. Man, that's a good image. Ah, man, I like that. With the huge new catalog of Hunter Garcia tunes, Jerry was emerging more strongly as a frontman. So this sounds like the era that then, creates the Grateful Dead as many of us knew them in the later years, as when we'd see footage of them on MTV for some reason or other, or whatever, or hear stories about, the concerts and things. His spirits, let's see. Oh, Jerry was emerging as a frontman, and I began to notice a kind of withdrawal in Pigpen. His spirits seemed good, but he was playing less organ on stage, or for long stretches, he would play congas, or tambourine, or not at all. In retrospect, it also could have been the onset of health problems. He had been drinking every day since early adolescence. But it never seemed to impair his performance. He would still sing on a couple of songs every night, but he hadn't played much of a role in our last 2 albums, contributing only one song. Bobby, on the other hand, seemed to be growing into his musical role. The increased transparency of the band's texture meant that I, for one, could hear what he was playing more clearly than ever. I found myself astonished, delighted, and excited beyond measure at what he was doing. Bob's guitar playing, like his sense of humor and attitude toward life in general, is quirky, whimsical, goofy, and rich in nuance and allusion. That's A-L-L, not I-L-L. Harmonically, he grasps and extends the implications of what he hears in a unique and provocative manner, enhanced by his prestidigitatorial ability to play on guitar with only 4 fingers, chord voicings that one would normally hear from a keyboard with up to 10 fingers. This period would see the manifestation of the turn-on-a-dime version of the Grateful Dead, a superbly responsive musical organism with lightning-fast reflexes. Bob, I love all this description. God damn, this is good. Like, this is how you talk about a band, for crying out loud. Music journalists, read this, for God's sake. This is how you describe these things in ways that are understandable and not the same old bullshit you tired metaphors and hackneyed catchphrases. Jesus, that don't describe anything. Oh, I'm really grateful that Phil Lesh wrote this book, and I found it at the library, because it's so. I mean, it's still musician speak. It's still far out, man. Spiritualist, hippie language in a lot of places, in a lot of ways, but it's still bound together by English language conventions that I think everyone can understand. Unlike, say, Ray Manzarek's autobiography, for crying out loud. Does anyone want a free hardback copy of Ray Manzarek's autobiography with all kinds of markings and highlights in it from when I was doing research for the Doors episodes I did a year and a half, 2 years ago? It's yours. Call in now if you want that book. It's my alarm clock is sitting on top of it next to my bed, and where it has been since I finished that Doors episode. If you haven't heard the Doors episodes, please go listen to the Doors episodes. Anyway, going back to Bob Weir, he says that Bob's new prominence meant that we now had an equally balanced texture of mixed metaphors. The bass as the anchor, Bobby's rhythm guitar as the hawser, H-A-W-S-E-R. That's a word I've never read before. And maybe it's a boat reference, it's nautical. And Jerry's lead as the sail. Billy provided the rhythmic driving force, or wind, and Pig soared over all of it with his outrageous raves. Got that? I like how he acknowledges that he's kind of going off here. Have you catch up to me yet? So I'd like to share a little divergence here, a little, less scholarly approach book-wise that I went on yesterday. I was trying to figure out what the dickens was the deal with Publius Enigma. And if you're a Pink Floyd fan of the 90s, the Pulse era, the Division Bell era, you might have heard about this. I didn't know anything about it until I read about it in a Guitar World magazine in 94 or 95. I think it was 94. I think Creed was on the cover or something. Sorry, Creed fans. But they were like the only new heavy rock band for a while there, and you had to hear them everywhere you went, and it was really depressing. And I remember coming away with the knowledge of like, well, they had broken the story about these cryptic messages on Usenet that were coming from someone called Publius Enigma, and they had shown in this guitar magazine how if you blew up and zoomed in on the cover art for Division Bell, you could see in like the mouth, I think it was like in the mouths of one of the statues on the front, those faces, the steel, faces on the front that are possibly influenced design-wise by the human use of human beings, cybernetics, and society by Norbert Wiener. Second edition, revised, Doubleday, Anchor publishers. If you go search for that, you'll see an image that it looks like it could have been a big influence. It's pretty cool and weird looking, but not the whole picture. There's way more going on in that Storm Thurgeson cover than just that one image that you'll see. Anyhow, among the things going on in that cover are what looked like a small pixelated microscopic postage stamp size image of the Dark Side of the Moon prism with, I think, a couple of digits on it. And then there was something else. There was another small microscopic postage stamp style digital looking, pixelated looking sort of image blown up. And I forgot what it was, because the reason why I'm being really non-conclusive here is it still didn't really register to me what the hell the point of this all was at the time. And I've done research via a couple of podcasts and some blogs online and some Reddit posts, and I still got nothing. I have no idea what the end goal or end game or resolution of the riddle was supposed to be. The messages from Publius Enigma were very pointed but intentionally vague, and they were like, look and listen and read and pay attention to numbers and go through it all again. Essentially, go back and listen to the album and then read the liner notes and look at the stuff that I've posted and correlate this with that, but not in a way that I can actually explain to you. And what most research turns up is the basic fact that, Pink Floyd played in Earl's Court for, I think, a few days at the beginning of their tour, and the words Enigma Publius were lit up during one song on stage, like bottom of the stage front area, kind of where the monitors would be, that kind of, not up in this nowhere where the band could really see it, is kind of what I think one of the implication was, because the band, David Gilmour, when interviewed about it later, was like, I didn't see anything. I don't know what you're talking about. I stand from where I stand on the stage. I couldn't, have seen those light up anyway. I don't do the lighting. Yeah, but you employ the people that do. So he's being cagey about it. And Nick Mason has publicly said in his memoir and interviews way after the fact that, yeah, it was something that was thought up by EMI to promote the new album and tour and to get people involved and give them a mystery to solve. And the idea was that whoever solved it would get a prize, but the prize was something it was going to be like a collection of trees out in this field or something. Like you would get like a plot of land with some trees that were, presumably you would have to maintain then, I guess. He said something touchy-feely and earth-centered like that. Through the podcast I listened to yesterday called Red Web, and which has no political connotations. I don't know why it's called Red Web. I couldn't get through the whole thing. very easily. It wasn't my cup of tea, but they're a mystery podcast, I guess. They cover different mysteries, and they have their own. They seem like they have some money behind them, I'll say that, and they have a fan base behind them because they talk about them in specific terms about their own fan base being mystery solvers as well that are engaged with the activities of the podcast that they're putting out, sort of, stuff for them to figure out. Kind of an interesting concept. I don't hate them, I'll say that, but I don't have a lot of patience for listening to other people's podcasts unless I'm already invested in it and the subject matter. So they talked about the fact that EMI did have someone in charge of this little project that had formerly worked for the Reagan administration in a little bit of espionage kind of type things. Not that he was a spy running around the world doing spy shit, but he had intelligence background connections to the CIA, perhaps. And this was like a fun thing, that he wanted to do for the Pink Floyd, brand, and was really into it. And that's that's the most you can get. And the funny thing was, the Red Web guys at the end of their episode, they're like, they read the quotes from Nick Mason and David Gilmour about like, yeah, it was just a thing that the label came up with. We didn't really, put it together ourselves. And they're like, the hosts are satisfied with that. They're like, I mean, that explains it. I mean, mystery solved. And I'm just annoyed and furious because no, the mystery's not solved. What was the end game? What was the riddle? Because I still, from what I've read of the reprinting on blogs and Reddit posts of what Publius Enigma was typing and sending out, via this they called it like a redialer. So you couldn't track this person down to, like, I don't know if it was like IP addresses that people would track back then, or however, they couldn't find, the what email account it was connected to or anything like that. And eventually that, I guess it was connected to a bunch of other sort of anonymous accounts, and it got hacked. So that also brought things to a halt, evidently. Mystery's not solved. I've even gone to publiusenigma.blog and read through some of one woman's 11 different chapters titled Publius Enigma Solved. And I assure you it is not, unfortunately. If you wish to check this out, I'm not gonna provide links. It was really sad. You can just search. If you just search Publius Enigma Solved, it'll come right up. It is really sad. It is the anecdotes of a woman who clearly has suffered either the abuse that she alleges she suffered at the hands of people like Sting, and I think a member of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but I forget, or someone connected to the band. And she is making the case that David Gilmour himself was directing her through his lyrics and Publius Enigma to heal herself and to be seen, and that there were lyrics he was writing in Division Bell that clearly indicated to her that he was sympathetic to her plight. I guess she ran in some circles that were connected to Pink Floyd and 80s, British rock aristocracy, dad music types, I guess. Yeah, it sucks. I mean, because it's not that she's dumb or crazy sounding. It's just the central thesis of it is, all this revolves around me, and all this is about me, and they won't answer me. They won't answer for what they did to me. But David Gilmour clearly wanted me to know that he would acknowledge it. So that sucks. And then there's just vague posts on Reddit from people like, I figured it out. It's about connectivity and people's relationships. And it was there the whole time from the first message. It's just about us. It's about us, and our connection with the music and other people. And so I don't know what the fucking point of all that was. If somebody solved it, is I'm saying, I know what the point of it was for marketing, and it's an awesome idea. Possibly, this being the first internet mystery ever, right? I mean, we're talking 4 years before the Blair Witch website went live and created that whole mystery of whether or not this film footage was real or not, that kind of thing. So that's the next one I can think of. I'm sure there are people that actually had internet access in the 90s that could tell me a bunch of other stuff, but Some of us had to wait until we got to community college and we could use the computer lab in 1997 before we could get online with any regularity. And even back then, it was just for guitar tabs. That was the only useful thing I could find. It's like news websites weren't good yet. If you were really plugged in, obviously, and you were on news groups and message boards, you could find communities and learn things and share cool crap. So that's the Police Enigma investigation on my part. I'll talk a little bit more about other research I did later.
Blow your mind when you see kooky gals with their bodies painted by a new wave pop artist in the wildest party scene ever put on film.
Now let's hop over to a man I have more than once in my life referred to as a pompous old windbag, Roger Ebert, January 1st, 1970. 2 stars on his review for Zabriskie Point. It says, one of the most unpleasant conventions of movie shorthand is that when adults are happy, they act like children. The hero, okay, I can't refute that. Right away. Okay. So far, you got me on your side, Roger. The hero and heroine fall in love, and lickety-split, the camera goes all mushy. And they race through the park, fly kites, feed the swans in the cemetery, and most important of all, giggle as the mustard drips out of their hot dogs. I've yet to see one of these sequences that didn't end with the lovers buying hot dogs from that bushy-haired Italian vendor whose specialty is peddling drippy hot dogs to lovers. Turns out the guy's name is Antonioni, and watch it, you're getting that stuff all over your Berkeley sweatshirt. Michelob, I feel like that deserves a quick swig of a nice beverage. Hope you have one, whatever it is. Michelangelo Antonioni is a fitfully brilliant director whose best and basic insight is that the fashionable cultivation of boredom can break down our ability to feel and love. In the 1950s, it seemed to him people became so shy of spontaneity that they lost the knack. His characters were so alienated and spiritually exhausted they could hardly even get through breakfast together. We loved it. Eclipse in 1962 had us leaving the theater feeling deliciously betrayed and alone. Blow Up 1966 was even better. It was set in swinging London and left us feeling betrayed, alone, and with it. In between, Antonioni gave us The Red Desert in 1964, possibly the most passive and empty serious movie of that decade. That was Antonioni's thing anyway, and he knew where he was going with it. But something, the enthusiasm young people had for Blow Up maybe, caused him to fall victim to that plague of personal directors, involvement. He had been getting his material out of his own instincts, but now he decided to do a committed movie about American society and the radical movement. The radical movement, gosh, what an innocent time when, like, everything that young people were protesting against was just wrapped up in that one little phrase, radical movement. I guess you're just talking about white kids. They're ignoring. You just ignore. Well, if we ignore women's lib and Black Panthers, and it's just young people being radical. They just want to be radical. They just want to run around the streets and shout things, I guess. I understand that's a lot of extrapolation or projection, possibly on my part. I suspect the project itself was exactly counter to his talents. He is not remotely an activist in his personal style, and I have a notion he recoils from people who raise their voices in public disagreement. But he managed to make Zabriskie Point anyway and cast his lot with the militants, who cast it right back at him. This is such a silly and stupid movie, all burdened down with ideological luggage it clearly doesn't understand, that our immediate reaction is pity. His earlier films have made us think of Antonioni as vulnerable. He shouldn't have exposed himself like this. The director who made Monica Vitti seem so incredibly alone is incapable, in Zabriskie Point, of making his young characters seem even slightly together. Their voices are empty. They have no resonance as human beings. Yeah, I can see that. I probably you kind of have to talk me out of agreeing with that sentiment, I think. They don't play to each other, but to vague narcissistic conceptions of themselves. They wouldn't even meet were it not for a preposterous Hollywood coincidence, which I will say that's one of those things that I have appreciated movie critics on YouTube waking me up to in the last 5 years, quite frankly. Anyone who likes to point out, because the script needs it to happen, it happens. Or, the entire series of events in this movie wouldn't have taken place if it wasn't for this weird coincidence that happens at the end of the first act. Things like that. It's like, it's okay sometimes. It's not like it's a crime, I don't think. But you start seeing it too much with big blockbuster movies, especially of the last 5-10 years. And like, oh, okay. So if he hadn't knocked that thing over right when she was walking by, then they wouldn't have found the magical thing to go find another thing and then another thing. He says, after the hero rejects radical rhetoric just like that, he decides to try direct personal action. And there's a clumsy sequence during which he maybe kills a policeman. The murder in this one is as iffy as the one in Blow Up. Then the hero steals an airplane, flies into the desert, sees the girl's 1952 Buick, buzzes it a couple of times, lands, and they go into the desert and make love. They make love, in fact, at Zabriskie Point, which is the lowest point in the United States. I've seen contradictions of this online, but it seems like it was generally of common wisdom for all most people knew. That is just as symbolic as Mount Whitney, which is the highest but colder. The love scenes are obnoxiously true to all the corrupt love scenes Antonioni copies them from. There is no feeling of liberation or delight or anything else other than a long, ridiculous time when lots of people roll around in the sand. Hey, this is Roger Ebert here, guys. He's the person who either wrote or co-wrote Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, so he knows something. I'm mostly not being sarcastic. I'm 90% not being sarcastic. Let's see. And here comes spoilers for you. The hero paints the airplane in psychedelic colors, flies it back to Los Angeles, and is killed by cops. Period. The movie is not this uncomplicated, but it certainly is this simple. Antonioni attempts to flesh it out with thousands of yards of outdoor billboards, which are supposed to show America being corrupted by advertising and capitalism, I guess. The fact is, Antonioni has no feeling for young people. In his European films, he allowed his characters to behave mostly as adults. But in Zabriskie Point, we get kids who fall in love and act like kids running up and down sand dunes, etc. And the side is even more depressing than adults doing it. He has tried to make it a serious movie and hasn't achieved a beach party level of insight. Man, that's 2 reviews that don't mention, like, the freaking ending of this. All right. Well, thank you, Roger. Now, jumping back to Phil Lesh and his narrative where we left off with it, talking about the different personalities in the band and this era after American Beauty. He says, earlier that spring, we'd made a momentous financial decision. Since the sound systems we'd been using everywhere, usually provided by the house or by the promoter, were so problematic, we bought the Alembic PA that Bear and Ron Wickersham had been developing for use locally and took it on the road with us. Remember that name, Bear, because we're going to get back to him. This necessitated an increase in the size of the crew. With this system, bigger equaled better, louder, and cleaner. Bear's goal was, as always, sound that was transparent, clean, undistorted, and very loud. Eventually, incorporating Bear's most extravagant concepts, for example, 32-foot-tall bass columns and a center cluster for vocals, this system was to grow and evolve into the fabled Wall of Sound. Now, Bear. Also, going by the much more convoluted name of Augustus Owsley Stanley III. This fella, first of all, had an injury to his inner ear on one side of his head after a diving stunt with some Air Force friends, and it ruptured the eardrum inside. I'm not a doctor. It fucked up half his hearing. Changed him forever when it comes to how he could hear equalization in different frequencies. He had basically no high end. You know, it's like putting stuff a bunch of cotton in your ears. For the rest of his life, that's what he heard on that side. So he only heard some low end and no clarity on one side of his head, and then normal on the other side. And that changed how he perceived tone forever. It altered it. But in spite of that, he's an amazing engineer in more ways than one. But he became the sort of audio guru for the Dead, their main point man as far as their sound equipment. And he had, when he met them, already amassed a bit of a collection in his home of gear and public address equipment, speakers, and cabinets and such. It's noted that in 1964, when he moved up to Berkeley, California in January, his new roommates noted that his conversation was like a series of lectures on the radar electronics he'd learned in the Air Force, the Russian grammar he'd studied when he was thinking of becoming a Russian Orthodox monk, the automotive technology he'd mastered while redesigning the engine of his MG. He went through a point in his younger life where he was obsessed with ballet. And Russian ballet at that, and he found one interesting note that'll come in later. That he found that he couldn't perform as a dancer on what he refers to as a mixed diet. So he changed his intake to be meat only, and that basically settled his hash. That's not the expression. I wish more people would use that expression, though. We got to bring that back. Can we bring that back? Can we be settling someone's hash? Not when it comes to digestion, though. Let's do it. Let's work on that together, community, because we are a community. Members of the community, thank you for being here. Let's work on reintroducing the settling of hash into the public zeitgeist and popular everyday nomenclature. So remember that meat thing. When he moved into his room, he brought with him boxes full of stuff like ballet shoes, a complete beekeeper's outfit, and a painting in progress showing the arm of Christ on the cross, portrayed more or less from Christ's point of view. The most amazing thing about this flagrant advocate for drugs, says his new roommate, was that he had only been smoking grass for a few weeks when he first moved in. And he just impressed them with how enthusiastic he was about drugs when he just met all these people for the very first time, and essentially they just begged him to please move in, probably figuring someone that had been in the Air Force and was more of an adult. Like, I don't know how old they were, but he was probably the most advanced human being they'd met, and he wasn't going to rat them out to the cops. So, and they could probably get drugs from him at some point. Smart kids. Until he got to be really obnoxious, I guess, in his pursuit of different chemicals. He had a huge stash of heavenly blue morning glory seeds, apparently, which contained a chemical similar to lysergic acid. Although Owsley would later say he had never taken any of them himself, he did put up 3x5 cards on virtually every bulletin board on campus advertising 250 morning glory seeds for sale for $1, along with the address for a post office box. Eventually, he wound up trading all the seeds for speed. During his methadone phase, Owsley began driving everyone in the rooming house crazy by running around all night long and then racing outside to ride his motorcycle at 3:30 in the morning. He had already dropped out of his university classes after 2 semesters. This whole pursuing education was actually part of a plea deal after he'd been arrested over on I think it was the East Coast, might have been Florida. I already forget. I read a lot about this guy today while at the China buffet in North Seattle, Washington, and it was fantastic, both the food and the reading. But I don't remember he gets arrested a lot. Let me say that. I'm not intentionally being lazy because I don't care. It's just that he's been arrested so many times. It's not immediately relevant to where I'm going with this, with his involvement with the Grateful Dead. So let's see. He moves on and he starts actually making LSD himself, learning how, and making friends. I think in the chemistry department at the UC library, he was all the organic chemistry and synthetic chemistry that I know about is the stuff I picked up in a few weeks in the UC library. But yes, he also made friends with a chemist or two at the lab in Latimer Hall at UC Berkeley, which furthered his enthusiasm for cooking. I don't know if it's cooking to make LSD. I've watched too much Breaking Bad. Eventually, he meets Ken Kesey, author of the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, unless that was Tom Wolfe. Was Tom Wolfe wrote it about Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters? Anyway, Ken Kesey wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and led the Merry Pranksters around conducting the acid tests, which was just, it's events. It's little sort of, let's get together and do some LSD in safety and relative, maybe not total privacy, but relative privacy to the outside world. Let's not be tripping over ourselves literally and figuratively in the public park all the time, in danger of getting hassled. And also, he gets in with the Hells Angels, who were invited by the Merry Pranksters to take part in some events. If you've listened to the show for a long time, you've heard me read a bit about them via the book Hells Angels by Hunter S. Thompson. If you haven't, you can scroll back through the feed, do a search for Hunter S. Thompson or Hells Angels in my feed, or probably easier if you go to the Libsyn hosting feed as opposed to the Apple Podcasts or Spotify. But hey, do your thing. The interesting thing about this era in his life is that he's a bit of a maniac, and the Hells Angels are maniacs, but there's an honor, there's a code of honor, and there's a mutual respect, and there's a desire for common good, even though they're all fucking nuts. He talked about how Terry the Tramp was a very cosmic dude. If you know the Hells Angels, you know who that is. If you don't, Google them. Like I said, excuse me, I got to watch my words here. Like I say, at some point in this podcast episode you're listening to, probably, I don't know because I keep going off on other jags of research and finding more things to record, and I'm messing around with the order that I'm placing them in sequence right now. So I apologize once again. You've heard me do this a lot if you're a constant listener. I don't know where it's going to end up, but I mention elsewhere that the story of the Dead and the story of the Pink Floyd sound are littered with all kinds of different partnerships and involvements with other people, organizations, creative or otherwise. And for a maniac like me, if I let myself go down every single road and rabbit hole, I absolutely will, and you will suffer, my listener, my member of this community. So I'm not looking up some of these details right now because I'm going to get distracted. He talks about how being accepted by the Hells Angels was a real boost to his ego. And to quote him, "There I was, very nonviolent, and I was with all these Hells Angels who like to punch each other out for the fun of it. I'd get around them half stoned, and I'd have the feeling they were like minor devils in the presence of the chief. I got this feeling of awe and respect from all these very powerful, intelligent, dangerous beings, and I could not believe I had really earned it." He likens their relationship with them and the cops to being much like wolves were to dogs. They both wore uniforms and were highly organized and very dangerous and armed. But the cops were a little more under control, like dogs. The angels were the wolves, but they were the same kind, and that was why they had this dance going on. He was supplying them with some very, very pure acid for their own use, but also that they could resell for profit on the street. And that's how they became this weird, dangerous, scary, but, very integral part of the Haight-Ashbury counterculture. Obviously, that didn't work out long-term for everybody's satisfaction, but it was there. It was a thing. They were, the peace and love folks and the get drunk on a keg of beer and punch out your friend and, gangbang your buddy's old lady crowd. They were a part of each other's sort of, what's the right word? Ecosystem for a while? Yeah, nobody was showering. Let's say ecosystem. The comment about the police is relevant because there's tales of incidents like Hell's Angels having a party at Ken Kesey's house, and Terry the Tramp gets a microphone and a PA of some kind, and he's like shouting at the cops that are parked across the road. They should all be thinking about that little old wife of yours back home with some dirty old Hell's Angels crawling up between her thighs. He asks the worthless fuzz if they're hungry and says he'll bring them out some chili if there's any left over later. But, don't rush home with it so that their wives could enjoy themselves to the fullest. Now, the relationship with the Dead and Bear would sort of get solidified around the time of something called the Trips Festival. It was at the Longshoremen's Hall in San Francisco on North Point Street, the weekend of January 21, 22, and 23, 1966. So Kesey's part of this. He had just been given a 6-month sentence on a work farm and 6 months probation for his marijuana bust that had happened down in La Honda. And then he's on the front page of the San Francisco, whatever the newspaper is there, whatever Hearst owned, I assume, since they're so close to Xanadu, whatever Randolph Hearst, franchise newspaper, publishes a front page story about him getting arrested yet again with his companion, Carolyn Adams, for smoking a joint on the roof of an apartment in North Beach. Stuart Brand is the guy that had the apartment. He is the guy who came up with the original concept of the Trips Festival with a visual artist named Ramon Sender. And then they bring in Ken Kesey. So there was somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 party goers who show up for this, out of their minds on LSD that Owsley had provided for the party. They jammed into a hall that was supposed to hold 1,700 people. A quote from Dennis McNally: "There were simply more people tripping in a single room than anyone had ever seen before." And Jerry Garcia would say, "It was total insanity. I mean, total wall-to-wall gonzo lunacy. Everybody was just partying furiously. There were people jumping off balconies onto blankets and then bouncing up and down. I mean, there was incredible shit going on. Plus, it was like an old home week. And I met it and saw everybody I'd ever known. Every beatnik, every hippie, every coffee house hangout person from all over the state was there, all freshly psychedelicized." The author of Bear's biography, Robert Greenfield, notes that with the Hells Angels punching out members of other motorcycle clubs in the hallways, as one of the merry pranksters tried to force Big Brother and the Holding Company off stage after they had performed just one song, the scene was so crazy, no one could control it. So here comes Bill Graham, who had been, promoting the shows at the Fillmore Auditorium and is a huge player in the Grateful Dead story, as well as anyone else that was playing rock music in the late 60s in San Francisco. He was actually brought in to help run this event, logistics-wise, and he was doing everything he could to stop the pranksters from letting people in for free. Oh, my God. So he's running all over the hall with this clipboard in his hand, looking for Ken Kesey, who is at the back door, letting in a constant stream of new bikers to enter the party. To keep the law from knowing that he was there, Kesey was attending the event in his silver spacesuit with a helmet. After trying in vain to get Kesey's attention, Graham finally lost control and began screaming at him. Without saying a word, Kesey simply flipped the visor of his helmet down and went right on doing as he pleased. Bob Weir would say, We were with the pranksters, and the buzz was, who's that asshole with the clipboard? But this is the night that they form a bond with Graham and combine their powers for future promotions. And there's a quote from Jerry Garcia It says, it was completely out of control, and he was trying to control it. And of course he couldn't, because the harder you tried to grab it, the more slippery it became. Jerry's clearly a fisherman. I was real stoned when I came into contact with Bill, and I could see right through all the bullshit, and I realized he was half terrified by what it was, and was doing everything he could to control it and to suppress the realization that there was something special going on there, besides something that was obviously making money. Now, an associate of the dead named Tim Scully was so impressed with the LSD that he takes at the Trips Festival. He has nothing, there's like nothing else on his mind after this than doing whatever it takes to track down the guy that made this acid. And it takes him months. Then he finds Owsley. Owsley then takes a few weeks to sort of check out Scully, and I don't know what that means in the parlance of the author of the book, but checking him out. I don't know if that means a background check or just hanging out with him and taking in his mannerisms and figuring out that he can trust him. Sorry, let me back this up. I was incorrect. Scully had done acid not at the Trips Festival that Owsley had created, and it was after tracking him down. Owsley brings Scully to the Trips Festival to see how he would react. Those two then begin working together on assembling state-of-the-art sound equipment for the dead, as well as the wholesale manufacture of high-quality LSD. So Owsley then joins the dead again a week later at the Sound City acid test, and it was held at a radio station in San Francisco. The band's trying to record what they've been doing live to accompany all the wackiness going on with the pranksters, and do this in a way that will sort of put it, let's document this. Bob Weir, during that evening, first sort of logged on to Owsley. He was dressed in medieval garb, had a pageboy haircut, and was wearing a ruffled shirt, and he was a dandy. Of course, I was loaded on LSD, so all that had its own little resonance with me. I was on Owsley acid when I met Owsley, and he seemed like one of us. I was 18 years old, and he was as old as Kesey, at least 30. But they were both more like kids than most kids you were going to see. We connected right away because he was a very, very interesting guy and seemed to know everything about everything, and that appealed to me. If you got involved in a discussion with Owsley even back then, you kind of had to pack a punch. I think Phil was his closest contact in the band. They had already bonded because they both had really high IQs and really good retention of information, and they were both really curious. Together, they added up to different kaleidoscopes, if you will. Well, no, I won't, because I don't know what that means. I mean, I know what you're trying to get across, Bob. Together, they added up to different kaleidoscopes. All right, we'll leave the wordplay to Phil Lesh, I guess, is what I'm saying. So Lesh and Owsley connect with each other at the Fillmore acid test, January 8th, 1966. So a couple weeks before Trips. Lesh thought Owsley looked like a conquering hero or some Robin Hood figure out of swashbuckling antiquity, wearing an Aussie dagger hat and a leather cape. He seemed to Lesh every inch the figure of the psychedelic warrior, a man who knows he's onto something cosmic and eternal. Now, I said the point of this was gear, right? Let's get to the gear. Because by the time he meets the dead, Bear already has purchased and installed a sound system in his own little cottage in Berkeley where he's living. A 35 by 35 foot living room that would surpass what the most fanatical hi-fi enthusiast at the time might have dreamed of owning. Looking like, quote, something that someone had rescued from behind the screen at the local movie theater, unquote, his Altec Lansing voice of the theater system consisted of two large wooden cabinets. For those of you that aren't players of rock stringed instruments, cabinets are the speaker boxes. When you see pictures of people on stage and there's like all those Marshall amps behind them, the cabinets are the wooden enclosures that house the speakers. And you got to carry those heavy bastards. If it's loud, it's heavy because it's powered by very strong magnets that weigh a lot. And they're encased in, wood panels, cabinets that need to be very, very sturdy and not come apart with all the vibration. So they're usually they're tough and they weigh a lot. And it says the cabinets are each the size of a small fridge. Then there's a 15-inch speaker, a driver that was about 4 inches in diameter, and then a little horn mounted on top. Each cabinet weighs 100 pounds. And then this sound goes through a Macintosh amplifier with 2 channels, 40 watts per channel. In Rock Scully's words, Owsley brought us together in a whole other way because he had a cottage in Berkeley where there were no neighbors who would complain about the noise, which is a big problem for the Dead up to this point. Because, they're just getting busted all the time anyway. There were no neighbors to complain, and the place was packed full of gear. He had tape decks and really good microphones and great speakers. It was the ideal haven, just as high-tech and fidelity as you could get back then. He also had these tape loops. And so for Phil and Jerry and all of us, it was just a playground. We could get something that going on a tape, start a loop, and then improvise on top of that. They decide, the Dead, to follow the pranksters down to Los Angeles in February of 1966. Jesus, that's we're covering a lot of ground in like a month here. To play a series of acid tests down there. Owsley provides money for them to make the trip. And they depart from San Francisco so abruptly that Jerry Garcia left his yellow 4-door Corvair parked in a gas station in Palo Alto. Jesus Christ, Jerry. All of Bob Weir's clothes were in the truck. Jesus Christ, Bob. But neither he nor Garcia ever saw the car again. Jesus Christ, fellas. And if you're in your modern head thinking, well, why didn't they just play the shows and then come back and report the car stolen and go to the cops and make sure the cops tracked it down? No, that's not going to happen. I mean, the cops aren't going to do any favors or spend any time with these like stinky hippies getting their stuff. They're going to laugh at them and be like, yeah, first they're going to laugh. Then they're going to want to hit them in the head with a baton and check them for drugs or just plant drugs on them and then throw them in the clink. No, you don't. If you're a member of a long-haired hippie rock band, you don't go to the cops when your shit gets stolen. Because the San Francisco police would rather you all just went away and moved back in with your parents, for fuck's sake. And stop coming to us with your problems, especially when you lose your own equipment and your own car because you were too stoned to take care of it.
Let's hear what Nick Mason has to say. Nick Mason is the drummer for Pink Floyd. This is an excerpt from his book, Inside Out. A per E of Pink Floyd. There's a sticker with a barcode on the front of this book, so I don't know what the title is. It's per E of Pink Floyd. I could look on the side, I suppose, on the spine of it. But I don't have time for that right now. The year's almost over. We'll all be at war with Mars soon. I'm opening to page 130. And he says, we rounded off 1969 with a bizarre experience in December working for the Italian director Michelangelo Antonioni on his film Zabriskie Point. After our happy encounter with Barbet Schroeder, we liked the idea of working with film. It fitted with our desire to work outside the normal round of records and gigs. Antonioni's project, a movie mixing together student radicals, West Coast psychedelia, and the destruction of society as we then knew it, was part of the death throes of MGM Studios, who in a final desperate bid to survive had offered Antonioni a hefty budget, hoping the success of his film Blow Up heralded a new era of European cinema. Suddenly we were in Rome, staying at the palatial Hotel Massimo di Azeglio. What we took a short time to adjust to was that the studio was paying a fixed daily rate for accommodation and food. If you didn't use it, you lost it. Due to the short notice of the project and Michelangelo's work schedule, we could only get time in the studio between midnight and 9 in the morning. This meant a routine of trying to sleep during the day, cocktails from 7 to 9, and dinner till 11, relying on the help of the sommelier to use up the $40 per head allowance. For we rolled in down via cover, exchanging banter with the hookers in the street corners to the studios where we could do battle with the director in his film. The problem was that Michelangelo wanted total control, and since he couldn't make the music himself, he exercised control by selection. Consequently, each piece had to be finished rather than roughed out, then redone, rejected, and resubmitted. Roger would go over to Cinecittà to play him the tapes in the afternoon. Antonioni would never take a first effort and frequently complained the music was too strong and overpowered the visual image. One device we tried was a mood tape. We submixed various versions and overdubs in such a way that he could sit at the mixer and literally add a more lyrical, romantic, or despairing feel by sliding the mixer fader up or down. It still didn't work. Antonioni ended up using an assortment of pieces from other musicians like Jerry Garcia and John Fahey, and despite a dramatic explosive finale, the film bombed critically and commercially. Continuing our policy of recycling anything remotely useful, we quietly gathered up all of our outtakes. There was sure to be some opportunity to use them in the future. Now let's jump to some notes from tvtropes.org, and I'll skip the intro because we've read from 2 reviews of Zabriskie Point already, but I'll include some of the details from the intro. It's a drama film, Michelangelo Antonioni, screenplay by Antonioni, Fred Gardner, Tonino Guerra, and Claire Peplow, and playwright and actor Sam Shepard. So that is like, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 writers on this thing. 5 writers on this thing that mostly plays out visually, in my opinion. A soundtrack by Pink Floyd, it says. I think among others would be a little more fair. Premiered February 1970. So there's 2 parallel plots that they mention that eventually intersect in the course of the story. Campus, radical, blah, 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 activism. Yeah, he may or may not have killed the cop. As a result of this action, he becomes a fugitive, goes on the lam, steals the airplane. Then there's Daria, a woman who works for a real estate firm, is driving through the desert towards Phoenix, much to the perplexity of her boss, Lee Allen, who is also her lover. Allen is currently pitching a vast real estate expansion across California and is anxious for Daria's company. Eventually, Mark and Daria come across each other in their travels across the desert, starting a journey of mutual self-discovery or self-delusion, depending on the pot they are smoking. The film was inspired by a true-life incident of a young man stealing an aircraft for a joyride and was inspired by other aspects of 60s counterculture. It is notable for its extensive location shooting in the downtown Los Angeles area, prominently featuring the Richfield Tower Art Deco building before its destruction, in Death Valley, albeit not the titular Zabriskie Point, and in Carefree, Arizona. Its cast of non-actors includes actual hippies and activists, including Kathleen Cleaver of the Black Panthers. In addition to the score by Pink Floyd, the album soundtrack features a number of songs from the Grateful Dead, the Young Bloods, Kaleidoscope, the Rolling Stones, and John Fahey, while Roy Orbison sang the end credits song, So Young. So here's some tropes we got, and there's a lot of them. Not as many as we've done before. I don't know if I'll have to skip any of these or not. They seem pretty much to the point. The protagonist is an anti-hero or a villain protagonist, depending on your political sympathies. Misguided protester at best and terrorist at worst. Author appeal. It says architecture, landscapes, and flying scenes. Appeals to a lot of the stuff Antonioni liked and featured in his earlier films. I assume there's author appeal in a lot of James Cameron entries in tvtropes.com that involve anything underwater or maybe blowing up stuff. I don't know. Big fancy house. The desert retreat of Lewis Allen and other real estate guys in Arizona at the end is a compound with a swimming pool and other amenities directly carved into the rock, a la Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. Bourgeois bohemian. Mark is implied to be fairly rich. He runs into his sister driving a fancy car in one brief scene, and he likewise is a very good pilot, skills that are not easy to come by. His crazy and desperate action comes from him trying to prove his street cred. He also invokes the bourgeois part of the trope for his advantage. Notably, he uses his white male privilege to buy guns without any security checks by noting the threat of Mexicans, which the owner readily accepts when selling said weapons to him. Yeah, that's right. That's an important scene to sort of point out that racial disparity that the movie wants to communicate. Let's see. Conspicuous consumption. Much of the film's cinematography deals with the omnipresence of this in America. The giant billboards, advertising, the display in the malls, and the tacky, insipid proposed commercials for the real estate project that Alan's company wants to install. The finale likewise focuses on the destruction of all the household objects in the house, which is played as a kind of liberation.
Oh, fuck yeah. Oh, fuck yeah.
Now, I'm going to talk about The Dead and Bear and Gear some more and some live shows. But from the point of view of someone who wrote Primal Dead at the Fillmore East for, let's see where it was originally published. I'm reading it out of the Grateful Dead Reader. This is February 1970 by Steve Silberman. And the top of the page, it introduces Steve as having written the following piece for, an August 1996 issue of Goldmine. To herald the release of Dick's Picks Volume 4, it begins chronologically to concerts recorded on that album in February 1970. So there's a lot here, and I recommend, hey, if you're a fan, if you don't already have the book, get the book. If you want, it is available for a 1 hour at a time borrow on archive.org. And I recommend checking that out. The scan is very clean, and I will be dipping into this at least once or twice more, I think, before I'm done. But I'm skipping ahead from the beginning of the article to a couple of pages in, and it says, part of the legendary status of this run in the oral lore of Deadheads is attributable to the fact that high-quality recordings of the late shows have been available in trading circles for years. For many Deadheads who came of age in the 70s and 80s, the low generation dubs of 213 and 214, 1970, were a holy grail that could be acquired with a reasonable effort. The odyssey of these tapes offers a fascinating perspective on how tape trading can influence the perceived history of a band. As the sound crew set up for the first show on the 11th, Bear patched in his Sony 770-2 to record the performance on 7-inch reels. Though taping Dead shows became de rigueur for hundreds of people a decade later, Bear, who had acted as the band's patron in the acid test days, was one of the first to realize that a band that jammed with such invention each night would be worth taping every night. There was another patch into the soundboard those nights, but only a Fillmore crew knew it. John Chester, who ran the house PA, was feeding a second deck, a Revox with 15-inch reels, through the snake running under the apron of the stage. The snake is like all the cables of your microphones on stage they plug into a box. That box then has a tightly wound series of cables that goes to each one of those sockets. And because, this prevents you from having to have a million super long cables going everywhere. And then you run it, somewhere, somehow from the stage to another relay box or straight out to the PA system somewhere else, the mixing board or whatever. One of the men on Chester's crew was a 24-year-old stage technician with a background in the traditional theater named Alan Mand. I got hired because I knew how to move things around in the dark quick, said Mand. Mand would play a significant role in Deadhead history by dubbing Chester's reels after the run and giving copies to one of the key figures in the nascent Dead tape trading scene, a collector named Bob Menke, a couple of years later. Copy the 13th was on a half-track reel, and the 14th was on low-grade cassette. Dubs of those tapes trickled out for years afterwards. Copies of copies crisscrossed the globe by mail and backpack, converting casual fans into full-fledged Deadheads wherever they went. The run of February 1970 provided the quintessential snapshot of the Grateful Dead at their finest, says John Scott. I'm kind of focusing on this because I figure if, like me, you're not
well versed in the works of the Grateful Dead, this article seems like it's, pointing to what might be a good place for you to start. As far as live stuff, obviously there's albums. Obviously there's plenty of stuff out there, but I mean, I'm the kind of person that, like, when you ask, like, what does the Grateful Dead sound like? The first thing I hear in my head is, that harmonized, clean guitar line of yeah, and I know everyone's like screaming now at me because that's not a Grateful Dead song. That's the Allman Brothers. That's Melissa. That's Dickie Betts, not Jerry Garcia. But I still think of that first because I think of major key, clean guitar melodies, sometimes harmonized. No, and then my brain goes trucking, da 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 da, yeah, and then. Probably the video for I Will Survive, or what do you call it? Touch of Grey, excuse me. I don't like that song. I don't even like the video. But it was a video that I have seen. Sorry, everybody. But hey, I'm enjoying all the research. I'm really enjoying the story of the Dead. It's not my kind of story because I mean, when I have my way and at my own sort of luxury, it's a story like The Doors or Led Zeppelin or, Metallica, like 4 personalities in one band making music I like and listen to, and, plenty of road hijinks. And then what is the story behind the inspiration for certain works that they came up with, and yada, yada, yada. I mean, Hendrix is another great one. Obviously, Motorhead. Obviously, Lemmy, I've done 2 episodes basically on. Kind of, sort of. Okay, you could say one big episode and then like a half episode for the Airheads watch along commentary. Anyhow, that's all. That's all staying in because this is all me not reading directly off the page to you and feeling like a hack, having some of my own actual thoughts. But now back to being a hack. There are several. This is. None is notorious as this as far as defining stance in Grateful Dead history. None is more deserving of the attention, providing showcase versions of almost all the Dead's important songs. Even after 27 years, these shows have not lost the power to surprise and amaze. And obviously, that was for publication in 1997, and now it's 2023. So I'm going to assume that even after the ensuing decades that came after that 27 years, the opinion would still mostly be the same. One of the people surprised and amazed by the tapes was Dick Latvala, who was one of the first generation of Dead tape traders years before he was hired as the band's official archivist. He was so impressed by the Dead's performance on the 13th, which Latvala hails with charismatic hyperbole as one of the most intense nights in the history of the planet almost. He sent an ad into Relics, one of the first tape traders' journals, offering anyone who had been to the February run free rent at his house in Hawaii for a month. Jesus Christ. Dick, calm down. Oh, I mean, I guess if you've got a house in Hawaii, you're probably pretty well set and not worried about too many things. I don't know. 20 years later, by the time Latvala had gotten the job of selecting historical performances for the official release, the Fillmore run had become so highly regarded by heads who heard hissy copies of the Chester reels that Latvala was deluged with postcards requesting the release of the master tapes on CD. And Latvala didn't argue. There were gaps on the master reels Bear had made where the tapes had to be flipped during extended jams. It turned out to be a good thing that the hidden deck had been running 15-inch reels to create a complete master. For Dick's Picks Volume 4, Jeffrey Norman of the Dead Studio was able to digitally patch in music recorded on the Chester deck to mend the gaps. Hey, great. The 2 different source tapes also explain why some Deadheads have believed for years that there was only one show each night. The Fillmore crew hadn't taped the early shows, which had to end at 11 p.m. There was too much stage work to do in a limited time to worry about the tapes. The copies in circulation were dubs of Chester's reels. One day at the studio about 8 years ago, said Letvala, Bear found a box of stuff, and he came up to the vault and said, these should probably be upstairs with the dead stuff. He opens the box, and there's 211, 213, and 21470. I just about had a heart attack. There were also master reels of the Dead's celebrated 520-70 performance at Binghamton, New York's Harper College in that box, featuring one of the warmest acoustic sets of the Dead's career, with harmonics by new writers of the Purple Sage. Rediscovery of the early shows was a bombshell to John Scott and his fellow collectors, much as if a second forgotten disc of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had turned up in the basement of Abbey Road Studios. The effects will ripple throughout Deadhead community for years to come, declared Scott, a stunning proof that there are still major archaeological finds to be uncovered in the world of the dead. And I'll keep going in a little bit. Hey, we're an hour 35 into this. Thanks for listening. Seriously. Thanks for listening to my guitar demos I did in my living room, because if it wasn't for you, no one would be listening to them. Let's talk Pink Floyd again. How's that sound? Another fun little investigation I kind of went on yesterday via podcasts is from an episode of Distorted. Oh God, what the hell was it called? Distorted News. It was pretty cool, actually. They have a 5-6 part series on Pink Floyd, and I only listened to the last one because that's kind of what I was curious about. Now, let me check myself. It's called Distorted History. And I don't know what the overarching sort of theme for the show is. I was just on, Apple Podcasts searching for Pink Floyd, and I saved and or downloaded a bunch of episodes of various shows. Always have been intrigued by legal wranglings in rock and roll, and I think Pink Floyd is one of the biggest ones that most people were aware of. Another big one being Black Sabbath fighting for the name after Ozzy Osbourne went solo. But Pink Floyd obviously has a similar kind of legal drama. And I read about it back in 2000 in Saucerful of Pink, which was a great book. I believe still has a good reputation for being a Pink Floyd, a very, very reliable Pink Floyd biography in general. And when it comes to the split, when Roger Waters leaves after the Works, post-Wall, and I'm going to get into some of that via Nick Mason's book and his account of things. There's a couple of interesting facts that I hadn't heard about before that I heard on this Distorted History podcast. And one of them was that, there's this sort of misconception that could be argued against that a momentary lapse of reason was dependent upon tons of extra collaborators and session musicians in a way that Pink Floyd hadn't done before. The counter to that is that, they had collaborators in the studio before this, but Roger Waters and company weren't giving those people credit. Not on this scale, though, admittedly, I believe, is not on the same scale as Momentary Lapse of Reason. But, Gilmour had done things like, I don't know, given his girlfriend writing credits on some lyrics that he was sort of pushing her to help him with. Giving co-writing credit on, I want to say it was Learning to Fly, to a partner of his who just came up with a chord progression in the studio with David. The kind of thing that lots of rock stars don't necessarily give formal credit to people for, the kind of thing that producers will do for a band without getting credit, but they'll get more points. They'll get more money per song, per download, per sale. That's the role of lots of the most famous producers out there, and you don't know that they're actually songwriters, but they are. They're arrangers as well. And David was very generous about that on this. And these were a lot of people that they had worked with in other ways or on other solo albums or other outings. All members of Pink Floyd had done some other weird, wacky, experimental stuff over the years and with other musicians, and they'd made a lot of friends and a lot of associates. Another thing that came to mind was how much alike Pink Floyd and the Grateful Dead can be in some ways, in that there's so much personnel. As the band grows larger and more ambitious, the personnel grows. You don't read a ton of other people's names when you read multiple books about Metallica, another band who became its own brand, right? But those are the people that make that world go around. There's a million of them that don't really get mentioned. And for whatever reason, and I'm glad, because I don't care when I read about Metallica. I want to read about the songwriting and the performances and the tensions and the production and whoever was working with them directly on the music, not branding and not merchandising, et cetera, et cetera. With the exception of Pusshead. I only recently found out that guy was like working for Thrasher magazine back in the 80s. Anyhow, tangent. Sorry, everybody. This is Pink Floyd and Grateful Dead, but this is what you get. You get Metallica talk everywhere when it seeps in. But it's funny because the Grateful Dead, the personnel come and go in little cliques and subcultures of people are swirling around the band at all times, but they all have wacky nicknames, unlike Pink Floyd, which is very much, high-minded business dealings and stuff, very professional people. And the necessary addition of extra voices for that first album back after Roger, bore fruit. And then they went on tour. And then when they came back for Division Bell, they were more united as a three-piece for a couple reasons. Number one, Nick Mason didn't play a lot of the drums on Momentary Lapse of Reason. He'd been away from the kit for 4 years. He was out of practice. He wasn't feeling all that up to it. And he then had the task of learning other people's parts to go out on tour. After that tour, he said, I'm never doing that again. I am playing on the next album from scratch. And you're going to see me in the studio. And that brought him back into a better musical relationship with the other two guys, Richard Wright and David Gilmour. Another factor, when the split happened legally between Pink Floyd, when they carried on, as David Gilmour said he would to Roger Waters without him, Roger Waters didn't get the message that we're going to carry on as Pink Floyd. He figured they were going to do whatever they were going to do. He didn't realize they were going to keep the name. So he took him to court after they filed legal documents announcing and solidifying their relationship, Nick Mason and David Gilmour, as Pink Floyd from here on out, and they started working on an album. Now, you notice I didn't mention Richard Wright there. This is the other thing about this that was really interesting to me. Richard Wright did not enter into the legal contract with Gilmour and Mason when, the post-works Momentary Lapse of Reason legal proceedings. His lawyers counseled him that was probably for the best, because there was going to be an expensive shitstorm coming. And if he didn't have, the desire to be in the middle of that, he could just be a musician hired by Pink Floyd from here on out. And that is what he chose to do. I think any grown adult who saw kind of the turbulent years that ensued, would be pretty charitable to Richard Wright, whereas a teenager or a younger person like myself back in the day, when I learned about the split, who didn't know this little detail, would have thought that was unthinkable. Like, I would never cash out of something as huge as Pink Floyd. Are you kidding me? It might have worked out for the best, depending on how much money Richard Wright had stashed away. I mean, we're talking about an era where they had so much money that David Gilmour bought a boat and with a recording studio in it, or put one in it after he bought the boat. And this did lead, but though there must have been some regret about the lack of money coming in as a non-member of Pink Floyd for Richard Wright, because evidently when they got together to work on songs for the Division Bell, they agreed they would vote on a 10-point system. Every demo they all brought in, they would. Each, the three of them, just rated on a scale of 1 to 10, and all the 10s would be priority. And Richard Wright only ever gave his compositions 10s across the board. So, come on, Rich. Come on, Rich. Also, my favorite bit about Division Bell, mysteries aside and legal stuff aside from the era before it, is the title was proposed by none other than my favorite author of my favorite books, Douglas Adams. Yes, yes. For those of you that listen to the podcast a lot and maybe some of the Patreon episodes, you know what I'm about to say. It's the fundamental interconnectedness of all things, by Jove. He was friends with the guys in Pink Floyd, and for his 42nd birthday, when they were on the Division Bell tour, they brought him up on stage to play with them. And as a birthday present, if you know The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know the significance of the number 42. I can't stress enough how cool I thought that was. And then immediately thought, oh, Jesus Christ, I've done nothing with my life. I'm forever Johnny Depp and Ed Wood laying in bed, like staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, telling his girlfriend, like, Orson Welles wrote and directed and starred in Citizen Kane by the time he was 25 years old. Here I am, 36 or whatever he was in that movie. And I haven't gotten a picture made. Anyways, I know it's unrealistic. I don't care. It still hurts. It still hurts. The guy wrote my favorite books and got to play on stage with Pink Floyd on his 42nd birthday. Anyhow, the fundamental interconnectedness of all things is a phrase taken from Dirk Gently's A Holistic Detective Agency, which is a wonderful read. If you haven't, if you need something fictional that's smart but also funny, I can't recommend his books enough. And he was, at that time in his career, a big conservation enthusiast and an environmentalist. And he wrote a book called Last Chance to See, which is a great detailed telling of his travels in Madagascar, I believe it was, to try to find the ii, this very rare mammal marsupial. I forget if it's a marsupial or not, but and his sort of experiences in learning and schooling along the way by these scientists and biologists and people that study this stuff and go out exploring and looking for these rare animals. And he was big on, environmental charities, specifically for animals that are on the verge of extinction, things like that. And more writings of his on those topics are in The Salmon of Doubt as well. Some articles he wrote before he died. Anyhow, point of this all is when he was listening to Richard Wright, Nick Mason, and David Gilmour talk to him about how much they were squabbling over the proposed title for the new album and unable to all settle on one, he proposed to them that he settle the matter for a price. If he could come up with a title they all would be happy with, then they would donate $5,000 to an environmentalist or preservationist charity that he was trying to help out. And they agreed. They took him up on his offer because they could always turn it down if they didn't like it. But turns out they did like it. It was the Division Bell, and he won. He won, and that charity won. So good friends. Yeah. Stories like that make me happy, clearly. Make me feel all warm and fuzzy in my tum-tum, to borrow a quote from a great philosopher from across the pond. If you're familiar with the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide joke about Belgium and the origins or the connotations of that word and its galactic origins, I did discuss it and play the audio from the radio series about it on the Patreon a few months ago. Just saying. It's only a few bucks a month, and it's an extra 4 hours of content about the history of rock and roll. And we're all over the place, from the invention of the 45 RPM record to the prehistory of rock in the 30s, 40s, to the history of the Rolling Stones 1969 tour of America that ends up with Altamont at the end, the Beatles breakup and all the legal wranglings that resulted from that. And then I throw in some audio every now and then of Gilbert Gottfried trying to sing one-hit wonders from the 60s and 70s, and little bits of a Monster Magnet White Zombie interview disc that I've had since 1995 that are really funny. And, sometimes it's more casual, sometimes it's more academic. It's a blend. It's mostly rock and roll history. There's not a lot of movie content because I tend to use that for the main feed, but if you want to support and you want more stuff about rock and roll history, I can't recommend the things I'm doing enough for you. The other helpful options are maybe share links to the show on social media with your friends or anybody that might be interested, or you could donate via PayPal. In the description of this episode, there are links. The usual liking on YouTube and subscribing on YouTube and on your podcast platform is really, really nice. It's tough to get up in the top results. Even when you search for history of rock and roll, even when you search for history of rock and roll in film, I'm not the first thing that comes up. What comes up are older podcasts that post more frequently that don't even have all those words in the name. That's just how the algorithm works. So if you like the show, and why wouldn't you, and you'd like to support the show and help it grow and get to other people's ears so I can feel like I have some sort of legacy before I die, and why wouldn't you, please check out the links in the description and click on one of those nice options. There's even some goofy t-shirts that I made up that have nothing to do with history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll, but I think they're wonderful. Like the one with the sun and the mountains on it and the words kindness and empathy are false gods. And below that, the subscript, betray your friends and die screaming in the forest, clutching their belongings. That's a good one. I'm not proud of much in this life that I've done, but I'm proud of that. Oh, hey, but I got off track when I was talking about Douglas Adams. I had set up something about the legal fight that was also jumped out at me yesterday. It was interesting. The legal sort of entity of Pink Floyd obviously infuriated Roger Waters for just by existing, that they would have the gall to do that kind of a thing. And he said that, this was just based on the idea that they had taken his notice to Warner Brothers to say, I'm no longer in Pink Floyd. I'll be doing things, without them from here on out. I'm not in the contract. A lot of it stemmed from a dispute over who could keep managing them. He didn't want to stay with their management. He wanted someone else. The other guys didn't. That was they were already fed up with working with him at that point anyway. And I assume it was just inevitable that this split was going to happen. But they used that announcement against him in court, and then his legal arguments or from his lawyers was basically, you can't use that. You have to find something more legally binding. That's just an announcement to the record company. That's just a formal communication that had to be done so that they knew what they're paying for. This part's implied on my part. This is what I think they're trying to say basically with this is, hey, I was the good guy that wanted the label to know what you're paying for, and Pink Floyd doesn't even include the main songwriter that's responsible for driving the train this whole time. But then the rejoinder or the response to that in court was basically, okay, then, you have no legal standing because all the legal documents that have been created since you made that announcement don't include Roger Waters. So what do you have that proves you are a part of this entity from a legal standpoint? And, that made things probably angrier. Rod Steam. But I said I was going to read from Nick Mason's point of view, and I will do that now. What Roger really needed was for the band to be formally dissolved to clear the way for his own solo career. And he probably assumed this would happen if he withdrew his services, given that Rick was no longer technically a member, because Rick Wright had been ousted during the Wall by Roger, basically, if my memory serves me correctly. I had done a little beyond motor racing and becoming a garage proprietor, and even David had become more of a producer and guest guitarist with other musicians than a band member. What no one anticipated was David's response to what I think he felt was the lack of credit and exposure for his contributions and ideas. The division of spoils, and more particularly credit, is often unfair, but he had perhaps suffered the most injustice. Even I, not prone to confrontation, felt aggrieved that after 20 years, I thought I was being told to quietly lie down, roll over, and retire. Although in the past, I had usually sided with Roger, who was, after all, one of my oldest friends. I was mortified at the suggestion that I had contributed nothing and was unemployable without him now. The quote I am credited with that I particularly like is, Roger was fond of saying no one's indispensable, and he was right. In retrospect, Roger probably made a tactical error going to law. And at one point, we were all set to go to court. However, since patience is not a word that appears in Roger's thesaurus, his innate desire to act rather than wait meant he was driven to bring everything to the boil and achieve the opposite result to the one he intended. For David in particular, one of the great spurs was the fact that Roger, hearing about the new plans for the album, had told him, "You'll never do it." Roger had already intimated that he thought that Pink Floyd was finished, and his falling out with Steve had escalated. Steve might be the manager that was part of this. With everyone feeling angry, we dug trenches to maintain our respective positions and refused to budge. Roger broke the phony war by announcing to the world that the band was over. This was a surprise to the rest of us, and it proved another incentive to make the album. And a quote that I did hear on the Distorted History podcast yesterday that was great was from David Gilmour saying, essentially on the subject of well, why go forward with Pink Floyd? Roger Waters is going to go solo, and why can't you go solo? I mean, he'd already done 2 solo albums at least at this point, if not 3. I forget what year About Face came out. That was kind of the more successful one. It had guest appearances from friends like Pete Townsend, etc. But he said, well, I didn't spend the last 20 years building up the name and reputation and recognizable brand of David Gilmour. I spent 20 years building up the name and recognition for Pink Floyd. That's what my efforts have gone to. And I'm being asked to just throw all that away and start all over from scratch. My name is not as popular as Pink Floyd. And I'm still here, and I want to keep contributing to that. So, I mean, that's not a legal argument that wraps everything up, of course. But I think it's a great moral sort of argument. I could see I could see either side, honestly. If my life had gone a certain way and I was in a band like this, I've been in a band that moved on without a founding member myself, and he was really cranky about it. But I can say honestly that the music that was made with that person at the peak of our endeavors and the music we made without that person bore no resemblance to what he had started the band as. with other people playing instruments back in the day. So I am sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to obviously the members of Pink Floyd in general, but Roger got the Wall production. He got the whole stage show for that. So I guess that was enough for him to move on with. And he later said in 1987 he would never play the Wall again until the Berlin Wall came down, which at the time was tantamount to just like pigs could fly, ha ha ha, get it? Pink Floyd and the pig and the fly. They fought in court over who had the legal right to use an inflatable pig at their shows. That was one of the contentions, I think. Everyone was pretty shocked in 1990 when he pulled off the Wall in Berlin, and when the Berlin Wall was indeed about to come down. Pretty fantastic stuff. I've watched it once. Could not believe the amount of guest stars that were on there. It's almost like a prototype for the Freddie Mercury Freedom concert that I've watched a billion times. And I was like, oh my God, look at all these people. Holy shit. I didn't know Sinead O'Connor was on this. I didn't know Cyndi Lauper was on this. Lots of cool stuff there. Back to the review of Primal Dead from February 1970. I'm, again, not going to just read the whole thing word for word. I'm going to skip around a bit. But I do want to include details about the show and who else was playing that night. The first night, after a set by Love, Arthur Lee's pop folk confection from the Sunset Strip, which had taken a Hendrix-like turn, the Allman Brothers played a raging set that included In Memory of Elizabeth Reed, Hoochie Coochie Man, and an extended Mountain Jam. A cheerful theme borrowed by the Allmans from the Dead, who had themselves lifted it from Donovan's There Is a Mountain. The Allmans' performances at the Fillmore shows had recently been slotted for release. And that was, again, 1997 this was published. The Dead's late show begins with a strangely dispassionate introduction by Kiva Crystal, an old waiter friend of Bill Graham's from Graham's days working as a busboy in the Borscht Belt. I included this note because I didn't know that Graham used to work as a busboy in the Borscht Belt. Ladies and gentlemen, San Francisco men and their music, the Grateful Dead. Ladies and gentlemen, I am a square. I am a dork. The Dead launch into the first Dark Star of the run, and it's a strong version. During this era of the Dead, Phil Lesh's bass was fully a co-lead voice with Garcia's guitar, weaving melodic counterpoint around Garcia's probing lines rather than metronomically keeping the beat. Phil Lesh is either the best bass player in the world or the worst, Graham Nash once observed. I mean, it's not like he keeps time. Classically trained keyboardist Tom Constantin had left the band 2 weeks earlier, which left new space in the music for the sinewy, stripped-down power of electric guitars. There's I guess Duane Allman is on stage with them during this performance, playing on Dark Star, doing his slide thing, and it's bluesier than normal. And then Bob Weir begins strumming a theme he lifted from a horn line on Gil Evans' Solea, from Miles Davis's haunting 1960 masterwork Sketches of Spain. Dead fans know this theme as Spanish Jam. Weir introduced it to the band at rehearsals in San Francisco's Potrero Theater in late 67, and they played it periodically, often as a guitar duet out of Space until Garcia's death. Wow, that's a long time. A version of it from the early 80s may appear on a Dick's Picks Volume 6 late this year. The Duende-saturated changes are a perfect setting for the multiple guitarists who add their own stinging accents to Weir's moody theme. The jam shifts abruptly into a marathon workout on Bobby Blue Bland's Turn On Your Love Light, with Greg Allman interjecting somewhat superfluous, "Can you feel it, baby?" amens to Pigpen's roadhouse praises of his superhuman lover, who's 9 foot tall, 6 foot wide, and wriggles like pigs fighting in a sack. Alan Mende recollected that while the other members of the Dead clustered around an octopus of hoses leading to a nitrous oxide tank in the upstairs dressing rooms, Pigpen held court in the sound shop in the basement with a bottle of Jack Daniels and at least 6 gorgeous women. Sorry. I think I want to live in that. I want to live in that thought for a little bit before I continue. Okay, I'm ready. By the time Love Light winds up, bass duty has shifted from Lesh to the Allman's Barry Oakley, and there are over 13 people on stage for the raucous conclusion. Of course, Duane Allman and Barry Oakley would die in 2 different road accidents in 1971 and 72 after this. 2 nights later, after the Allman and Love sets and an early show that featured a high-energy St. Stephen singing into the Buddy Holly anthem that the Dead made their own Not Fade Away. Oh, is that why? Okay, all right. That's why Not Fade Away is so prominent as, like, I don't know. I mean, I love the song, but I've only heard the Buddy Holly version. I always noticed that it was kind of that title would pop up for, books and articles and things like that. And like, this is a Buddy Holly song I don't really hear much. Okay. Then they play a late show with acoustic versions of the spooky traditional ballad Little Sadie and Jesse Fuller's spirited Monkey and the Engineer, as well as medley of the Everly Brothers' Wake Up Little Susie into Black Peter that was released on Bear's Choice. One of the delights of the whole run was hilarious stage banter. This is the part of the article that actually drew my attention, so I definitely want to cover this. Often at the expense of Bear and the stage crew, during a tune-up for I've Been All Around This World, Bob Weir, warned the audience that you could lose a finger using a Bill Russell double-action capo, and glanced over at Garcia, who, of course, was minus a finger, accidentally chopped off during his childhood. The early show on the 14th features this episode of stand-up comedy, Dead Style, Bob Weir. We're going to investigate this here crackling sound. Garcia, everybody hold your breath. Weir, it just went away. Hey, could we have more monitors? I want to shout and scream. Garcia, yeah, we need more monitors here. Feedback. And monitors are the small wedge-shaped speaker cabinets at the front of every stage that point back at the artist in question. Weir, not much of an improvement. It ain't like it was last night. All caps. I want it like it was last night. More feedback. The swamp's fighting off all the alligators. Garcia plays the opening notes of Dark Star. Bob Weir. I hope none of you heard that. Garcia. Seen any good movies lately? More feedback. I'm assuming Bear or someone in the crew, front of house crew, is heckling them by increasing the signal to their monitors, thus creating feedback between their vocal mics and the speaker in front of them. We're gonna hang up here and bleed up your ears. Pigpen says, I got mice in my guitar. Garcia says, let's wait until this passing screech goes by. Blast of piercing feedback. Garcia, that's nice. Very nice. Euphonious, you might even say. We're put a spotlight on the PA man. Lesh, he deserves a spotlight. The narrow-beamed spotlight focuses. We're, he's responsible for our loss of high-frequency hearing. Did you know that? Lesh, yes, it's hard for us to discern spoken words in quiet rooms. We're, sibilances and such. Lesh, consonant. Inaudible. Are we through now? Garcia, geez, we just started, man. Woman in the audience, yeah, man. Bob Weir, Usher, eject that chick. Garcia, yeah, man. This is out of sight, really, man. Nothing's weirder than coming to New York. Then Les counts off Dark Star. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right after one of the acoustic interludes on the 14th, Garcia can be heard looking for the microphone guy. The crew member in question was young Mandy, who had other things on his mind at the moment. Everything went fine on the 13th, but on the 14th, I got totally Owsley-ized. When I heard them calling for me to come backstage to get set stuff up, back on stage to set stuff up, I was tripping out of my mind, laying on my back in one of the aisles. On the 14th, a spotlight swept down on the legendary WNEW-FM DJ Zachary, known by many as the ominous voice of Chiller Theater, who introduced himself as Jonathan Schwartz, WNEW's morning DJ, before giving the Dead the punchiest intro of their career, the Grateful Goddamn Dead. Yeah, I know Zachary from the Halloween Hootenanny album, which I highly recommend for your holiday listening pleasure. He intros it and he outros it, and he sings a cover of Sinister Purpose by Creedence Clearwater Revival, performed by one of my favorite bands ever. Okay, not ever. Let's be charitable. One of my favorite bands since I've been in my 30s and 40s, Southern Culture on the Skids. Dig it, baby. Check it out. He just does a spoken word recitation while they groove behind him, and it's fantastic because he's very corny. He's like, Sinister Purpose, knock, knock, knocking at your coffin lid. Come and take my hand. Burn away the goodness, you and I remain. Did you see the last war? Well, here I am again. Yeah, I've been listening to that album every year for all of October since it came out in 1999. I had to special order it. This is pre buying all your crap on the internet era. You looked it up on the internet and then you went to the record store and bugged them to order it for you. Great stuff. I love almost every song on that album. Halloween Hootenanny, produced by and organized by Rob Zombie himself. But it's not Rob Zombie music. It's mostly surf bands and hillbilly bands and loungy stuff. Although he does sing the lead-off track with, I think it's the Ghastly Ones. Or, yeah, it's not Satan's Pilgrims, and it's not the Bomboras, it's the Ghastly Ones. It's freaking rules. Anyway, yeah. What are we talking about next? I mean, there's so much in these articles to keep going, but I think we hit the high spots, because some of this I don't want to get too into, because it's just like song by song, track by track reviews of Dead stuff. So, you know, it's like other episodes of the podcast where or especially the Patreon episodes where I'm reading out of Ed Ward's History of Rock and Roll. It's like there's just so many singles that came out like every month, you know, from 1952 to 1959. That ends up being what the history of rock and roll mostly is, and it's not fun to read aloud. I tend to like only read a couple pages of that at per episode, per 2-hour episode. because it's really dry. But that's the thing. The history of rock and roll in the early days is a history of record companies and labels, as evidenced by all the appendices in The Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll by Nick Tosches. Also highly recommended. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that I learned more about the career of Zachary Lee as a horror host, a regional horror host, from the Dana Gould Hour podcast. And one of the Halloween episodes, they talked about there's a reason why, like, all at the same time in, I want to say, the late 50s, or maybe it was later than that, post Vampira, being a host, there were a million small town or regionally sensational, very popular horror hosts all around the country, depending on what your TV station was, where, what kind of a budget they had to hire talent, and whether they wanted to commit to like a set and a host and some props and stuff. It happened all at the same time around the country because Universal Pictures put out a like 300 to 500 title package of films to be shown on television. They were trying to get their stuff out there after, the movie industry is kind of sliding into decline financially. And they had a million movies that were mostly not great. And they wanted to get they wanted to get them back out there in the public's eyes. And there was some deal they made with a ton of TV stations across the country. And so they had these corny movies, and I mean, some of them were scary, but most of them were not. And all these stations that bought that package basically committed to having a weekly nighttime show to have a host introduce these films, talk about them, throw it to commercial, bring it back. And everybody had a guy, apparently, in every major TV market in the country. You had some spookier and some sillier than others. You had, I don't know how many women there really were, mostly men, I'm sure. But yeah, that whole phenomenon, that's an era I wish I could live through, quite frankly. But then, I'd probably be in much worse shape chronologically now if that was the case. Who knows? That's why I'd be such a terrible, is invalorous a word? Having no valor? What's a word for having no moral motivation to do anything properly impactful? If I was a time traveler, I'd be the shittiest time traveler ever. I'd just go back a couple of generations and see a bunch of bands and movies when they first came out. Yeah. Ooh, what's that over there?
Remember to replace the speaker on the post when you leave the theater.
Well, friends, it's the end of the year. I hope you got through it okay. I hope you're safe. I hope you remember that you deserve to be loved and you deserve to be able to do fun, creative things that make you happy. Thanks for giving a damn about rock and roll. Thanks for giving a damn about movies. Thanks for supporting a show that is very far outside the normal formats of what's successful and just done by one dork. I think I'll cram one short episode in before the year's totally over. I have a couple of self-serving motivations there to fire off a couple of things and share some links to some stuff I've done recently on other people's shows, maybe, or other people's creative endeavors that I was a part of that I want people to hear. I'll include that in the next little shoot episode. But till then, know that I have more Pink Floyd content already recorded, more Grateful Dead stories already recorded, and more to add to, and more books coming from the library about both. Please do not ever forget that rock and roll is the best, and so are you.
Rock and roll music and why I preach against it, and I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today.
Oh shit. This is where yeah. The DiCarlo dip down begins.
There's wickedness attempting to completely cover this nation in perversion and seductive, seducing spirits. I have never seen more images of more mermaids and water people in my life. That's a division in the kingdom of darkness, and they're highly technologically advanced.